Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place where your thoughts can slow down and curiosity can soften into something gentle enough to carry you toward rest. Tonight, we begin a calm and careful journey into a subject that is often described in sharp, technical language, but which, at its heart, is deeply human. We're going to explore how scientists are learning to listen to the brain, not by reading minds, not by uncovering secret thoughts, but by patiently studying the soft electrical patterns that ripple through neural tissue as we speak. Remember, pay attention, or feel low. Before we settle in fully, I'll gently invite you, only if you wish, to like this video and subscribe to the channel if these quiet explorations help you unwind. And if you're still awake enough to feel sociable, you're always welcome to leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. There's something comforting about imagining this shared moment stretching across time zones, from early evenings to deep nights. Now feel free to lower the lights, adjust your pillow, or simply let your eyes rest. This is not a lecture to stay alert for. It's a slow walk through ideas where nothing needs to be memorized and nothing is expected of you. If your attention drifts, that's perfectly fine. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. Tonight's journey is called Decoding the Brain, and to begin, we need to understand why anyone would even try. When people hear the phrase decoding the brain, it can sound dramatic, even unsettling. It might bring to mind images of machines that can peer directly into your thoughts, translating private ideas into words on a screen. But the reality is far quieter and far more humble than that. At its core, decoding the brain is not about extracting meaning. It is about recognizing patterns. The brain does not store thoughts the way a book stores sentences. It does not hold memories like files in a cabinet, neatly labelled and ready to be pulled out. Instead, the brain is constantly active, even when you are resting, producing shifting patterns of electrical activity as billions of neurons communicate with one another. Each neuron sends brief electrical pulses to its neighbours. These pulses are not words or images or emotions, they are simply signals, tiny flickers of activity passing from cell to cell. Decoding begins with a simple question. When a person speaks or remembers or pays attention, do the patterns of these signals change in reliable ways? For a long time, scientists could only guess. The brain was hidden safely inside the skull, protected by bone, inaccessible to direct observation. Researchers relied on injuries, behaviour and indirect measurements, slowly building rough maps of function. This region seems important for language. That area appears involved in memory. It was like trying to understand a city by watching its lights from an airplane at night. But over the past few decades, new tools have allowed scientists to listen more closely. Electrodes placed on the scalp, or sometimes directly on the surface of the brain during medical procedures, can detect the collective activity of neurons beneath them. These tools do not hear individual thoughts, they hear rhythms, waves, fluctuations that rise and fall as the brain shifts from one task to another, and that is where the ambition begins. If certain patterns tend to appear when someone is speaking, and different patterns appear when they are silent, then perhaps those patterns can be recognized. Not interpreted like a language, but identified, the way you might recognize the sound of rain versus the sound of wind. You don't need to know where each raindrop lands, you just notice that the overall sound has changed. This distinction is important because decoding is often misunderstood. It is not about uncovering hidden meaning inside the brain. It is about linking observable patterns of activity to observable outcomes. A sound produced, a movement made, a memory successfully recalled or not. In this way, decoding is closer to weather forecasting than to translation. A meteorologist does not understand a storm in a personal sense. They study pressure, temperature, and wind patterns, learning which combinations tend to produce rain. Similarly, neuroscientists study patterns of neural activity, learning which combinations tend to accompany speech, attention, or mood. Why pursue this at all? Part of the answer is deeply practical. Many people lose the ability to speak, move, or communicate due to injury or disease, even though the brain areas that plan those actions may still be active. If scientists can recognize the patterns associated with intended speech or movement, they may be able to help restore communication, giving someone a way to express themselves again. Another part of the answer is curiosity. For centuries, the brain was treated as a black box. Thoughts went in, actions came out. What happened in between was a mystery. Decoding offers a way to peek inside, not to solve everything at once, but to trace the outlines of how experience and activity are linked. It's important to note what decoding does not promise. It does not claim to explain consciousness. It does not claim to reveal why a memory feels the way it does, or why sadness carries a particular weight. Instead, it focuses on relationships. When this pattern appears, that outcome becomes more likely. When this rhythm changes, attention shifts. Think of it like listening to an orchestra from outside the concert hall. You cannot see the musicians, you cannot read the sheet music, but you can tell when the tempo speeds up, when the strings fall silent, when the percussion takes over. Decoding is learning to recognize those changes, even if the deeper meaning of the music remains out of reach. And perhaps that is what makes this endeavor so compelling. It is ambitious but cautious, bold but restrained. Scientists are not claiming to have solved the mind. They are learning to listen carefully, to notice patterns that were once invisible, and to use that knowledge to help, to restore, and to gently explore one of the most complex systems we know. As we continue this journey, we'll see how this quiet ambition plays out in real examples. How speech can emerge from silence, how memory can falter and sometimes be nudged back on course, how attention filters a noisy world, and how mood can become trapped in a rigid loop. But for now, it's enough to rest with this simple idea. Decoding the brain is not about reading who you are. It is about learning how the brain moves, hums, and shifts as you live your life. A careful listening carried out one pattern at a time. It's almost impossible to talk about the brain without at some point reaching for the language of machines. We speak of processing information, storing memories, sending signals, running programs. These phrases slip into conversation so easily that we barely notice them anymore, and for good reason. The computer metaphor does useful work, at least for a while. At a glance, the similarities are tempting. Computers receive inputs, perform operations, and produce outputs. The brain receives sensory signals, transforms them, and generates actions. Both systems rely on electrical activity. Both can be described in terms of networks. Both can fail in ways that seem oddly familiar, freezing, misfiring, or getting stuck in loops. So it's natural to ask whether decoding the brain is simply a matter of reading its internal code. If we could just access the right signals, perhaps we could translate them the way a computer translates binary into images, words, and sound. But here is where the metaphor begins to wobble. A computer is built from the top down. Its basic units are simple, identical, and obedient. Each bit has a clear meaning, 0 or 1, on or off. The rules that govern how those bits are combined are fixed in advance, written by designers who already know what the system is supposed to do. When a computer runs a program, it is executing instructions that were fully specified before the machine was ever turned on. The brain is nothing like this. Neurons are not identical components. Each one has its own history, its own connections, its own chemical environment. Their signals are not clean switches but messy pulses that vary in timing, strength, and context. A single electrical spike can mean different things depending on when it arrives, where it arrives, and what the surrounding network is doing at that moment. Even more importantly, the brain does not come with a master program. There is no central list of instructions telling the brain how to speak, remember, or pay attention. Instead, these abilities emerge gradually, shaped by development, experience, and constant interaction with the body and the world. The brain learns its own rules as it goes. It rewires itself, strengthens some connections, weakens others, and reorganizes its activity in response to success and failure. If a computer is like a carefully written book, the brain is more like a conversation that never stops. This difference matters deeply for decoding. When engineers decode a computer, they know what they are looking for. They already understand the levels of organization. Transistors form logic gates. Logic gates form circuits. Circuits run software. Each layer has a clear relationship to the one above it. In neuroscience, that vertical ladder is missing. We know a great deal about neurons, we know a great deal about behavior, but the bridge between them, the smooth explanation that links tiny electrical events to thoughts, memories, and decisions, remains incomplete. This is sometimes described as the lack of a vertically integrated theory. We can describe each level, but we cannot yet fully explain how one level becomes the next. Decoding, then, does not proceed the way code-breaking does in computing. There is no single key that unlocks meaning. Instead, decoding works sideways. It looks for reliable associations across time. When these patterns appear, that outcome tends to follow. When they disappear, the behavior changes. This is why decoding often feels probabilistic rather than exact. A particular neural pattern does not mean a specific word in the way a byte corresponds to a letter. It means that a certain class of outcomes has become more likely. A movement is being prepared. A sound is about to be produced. Attention is narrowing. The computer metaphor also breaks down when we consider scale. A computer operates at a few well-defined levels. The brain operates across many overlapping scales at once. Individual neurons fire in milliseconds. Networks shift their activity over seconds. Learning unfolds over days, months, and years. Emotional states can persist for hours or longer. All of these scales interact, influencing one another in ways that are difficult to separate. Decoding tools usually capture only a slice of this complexity. An electrode may record activity from thousands of neurons at once, blending their signals into a single trace. That trace can still be useful. It can still correlate with speech or memory. But it is not a full description of what the brain is doing any more than a single microphone captures the experience of an entire city. And yet, the computer metaphor does not fail completely. It remains helpful as a starting point, especially when thinking about interfaces. When the goal is to connect brain activity to an external device, treating signals as inputs and outputs makes practical sense. It allows engineers and clinicians to build systems that work, even if the deeper theory is still under construction. This leads to an important shift in perspective. Decoding the brain is not about finding the brain's software. It is about building translators that operate at the boundaries, devices that listen to patterns and respond in useful ways without claiming to understand everything in between. You might think of it like learning to drive a car without knowing how the engine works. You learn that pressing the pedal makes the car go faster. Turning the wheel changes direction. You can operate the system effectively while remaining largely ignorant of the mechanical details beneath the hood. In neuroscience, this pragmatic approach has become increasingly common. Scientists accept that full understanding may take decades or longer. In the meantime, they focus on what can be predicted, what can be influenced, and what can be restored. This humility is not a weakness. It is a recognition of the brain's nature. A system that is alive, adaptive, and constantly changing resists simple metaphors. It refuses to sit still long enough to be fully diagrammed. So when we ask whether the brain is a computer, the most honest answer is this. Sometimes at certain levels and for certain purposes, it behaves enough like one to make progress. But at its core, the brain is something stranger, a living network that builds itself through action, learns from its own mistakes, and carries its history forward into every new moment. As we move deeper into decoding, this tension will keep returning. Between clarity and complexity, between prediction and understanding, the computer metaphor will help us step forward and then gently remind us where it no longer applies. And that reminder is not discouraging. It is an invitation to listen more carefully, to accept partial answers, and to appreciate the quiet richness of a system that cannot be reduced to a single machine. If decoding the brain begins with listening, then the next natural question is a simple one. How do you listen to something that never speaks out loud? The brain is quiet in the ordinary sense. It makes no sound, produces no vibration you could hear with your ears. Yet beneath that silence, there is constant motion. Neurons communicate using tiny electrical changes, brief pulses that ripple across networks like faint flashes of light. These pulses are not dramatic. They are small, fleeting, and deeply embedded in the surrounding tissue. To listen to them, scientists have had to become very patient and very creative. The earliest attempts were crude by today's standards. Electrodes placed on the scalp could detect large-scale rhythms, slow waves that rose and fell as the brain shifted between sleep, wakefulness, and concentration. These signals were blurry, like listening to a crowd from far away. You could tell when the crowd grew louder or quieter, but not who was speaking or what they were saying. Over time, techniques improved. Electrodes became more sensitive. Computers became better at detecting subtle changes. Researchers learned how to place recording devices closer to the brain itself, sometimes directly on its surface during necessary medical procedures. This brought the signals into sharper focus, though never into perfect clarity. It is important to pause here and gently adjust expectations. Even the most advanced recordings do not capture individual thoughts. They capture patterns created by many neurons acting together. When scientists say they are recording brain activity, they're usually measuring the combined electrical behavior of thousands, sometimes millions of cells at once. Imagine standing on a hill, overlooking a city at night. You cannot see individual conversations. You cannot hear private thoughts. What you see are lights turning on and off, traffic flowing, neighborhoods growing brighter or dimmer. From those patterns, you might infer that people are waking up, commuting, gathering, or settling down to sleep. Brain recordings work in much the same way. Different tools offer different kinds of listening. Some methods prioritize timing. They're very good at telling when something changes down to tiny fractions of a second. These tools are sensitive to rhythm, to the quick flicker of activity that accompanies movement or speech. Other methods prioritize location. They can show which regions of the brain are more active than others, painting a slow-moving map of engagement across the cortex. Each approach involves trade-offs. Tools that are fast tend to be blurry in space. Tools that are precise in space tend to be slow. There is no single device that captures everything at once. Decoding always works with partial information, choosing which aspects of the signal matter most for the question at hand. What all these methods have in common is that they measure change. They do not read static information, they detect shifts. When a person begins to speak, the pattern of activity changes. When attention narrows, rhythms reorganize. When a memory is successfully recalled, certain networks become more synchronized. These changes are the raw material of decoding, but even here, caution is essential. A change in brain activity does not automatically reveal meaning. It only reveals difference. One pattern is not a word. Another pattern is not a feeling. They are simply arrangements of activity that tend to appear alongside certain experiences or behaviors. This is why neuroscientists talk so much about correlation. They observe that when someone performs a task, certain signals reliably appear. When the task stops, those signals fade. Over time, these relationships become predictable enough to be useful. But they remain relationships, not explanations. Listening to the brain is also shaped by context. The same pattern can mean different things depending on what the person is doing, what they have just done, and what state the rest of the brain is in. A signal associated with movement during one task may look similar to a signal associated with speech during another. Decoding systems must learn these subtleties, adjusting their expectations based on the broader situation. This complexity is one reason why decoding often works best within individuals. A pattern learned from one person's brain does not always transfer neatly to another's. Each brain has its own history, its own wiring shaped by development and experience. Decoding is, in many ways, a personal conversation between a system and a specific nervous system. There is also the question of noise. The brain is never silent. Even when you are resting, it hums with spontaneous activity. Signals overlap. Networks talk over one another. Recording devices pick up everything at once, mixing useful information with background chatter. Decoding requires filtering, separating the faint signal of interest from the constant buzz of ongoing life. This filtering is not perfect. It relies on statistical techniques, on learning which patterns tend to matter and which can be ignored. The result is never certainty, it is likelihood, confidence that this pattern probably corresponds to that intention, that this rhythm likely signals a shift in attention. And yet, despite these limitations, listening works. Again and again, researchers have shown that meaningful information is present in these signals. Enough information to predict whether a word is about to be spoken, enough to estimate whether a memory will be successfully retrieved, enough to detect changes in mood or focus. The key is not precision, but consistency. If a pattern appears reliably under certain conditions, it becomes useful, even if its deeper meaning remains mysterious. This is the philosophy that underlies much of modern decoding. Listen carefully, collect many examples, learn the regularities, build systems that respond to those regularities in helpful ways. There is something quietly poetic about this approach. Scientists are not forcing the brain to reveal its secrets. They're sitting with it, listening over time, learning its rhythms the way you might learn the habits of a place you visit often, not by interrogating it, but by paying attention. As we continue, this idea will return again and again. Decoding depends not on perfect access, but on patience, not on understanding every detail, but on respecting patterns that repeat. The brain speaks softly, in signals that are always incomplete, and decoding is the art of hearing just enough to make a difference. There is a quiet tension running through much of brain science. On one side is the desire to understand, to explain, in a clean and satisfying way, how electrical activity becomes memory, emotion, or attention. On the other side is a more immediate concern, to help people who have lost the ability to speak, move, remember, or feel like themselves. Decoding lives in the space between these two goals. In an ideal world, scientists would first uncover a complete theory of the brain, one that smoothly connects neurons to thoughts, circuits to consciousness. Only then would they build tools to intervene. But biology rarely waits for ideal conditions. People need help now, and the brain does not pause its suffering until theory catches up. This is why decoding has often moved forward without full understanding. In many cases, researchers do not know exactly why a particular neural pattern predicts an outcome. They only know that it does. When a certain rhythm appears, speech is more likely to follow. When another pattern dominates, memory tends to fail. These observations are not explanations. They are regularities, discovered through careful listening and repetition. And yet, those regularities can be powerful. Medicine has always advanced this way. Long before anyone understood germs, doctors noticed that certain practices reduced illness. Long before the chemistry of pain was mapped, physicians learned which plants eased suffering. In each case, action came before explanation. Understanding followed later, often much later. Decoding the brain follows the same tradition. If a system can reliably detect when someone intends to speak, even without knowing how intention arises, it can still be used to restore communication. If stimulation can gently shift the brain away from a state associated with severe depression, even without explaining why that state feels so heavy, it can still bring relief. This approach can feel unsettling, especially to those trained to value deep explanation. There is a fear that without understanding, intervention becomes guesswork. But in practice, decoding is not blind. It is guided by data, refined through feedback and constrained by careful testing. Think of it like learning to balance on a bicycle. You do not need to understand the physics of balance to stay upright. You learn by feeling, by noticing when you're about to fall and adjusting. Over time, your body becomes very good at predicting and correcting instability, even if you could not write down the equations that describe it. Decoding systems learn in a similar way. They are trained on examples. When this pattern appears, this outcome follows. When it doesn't, it doesn't. The system adjusts, becoming better at prediction, even if the deeper causes remain opaque. This does not mean understanding is unimportant. It means it is not always the first step. In fact, decoding can sometimes guide understanding rather than waiting for it. When a particular signal proves useful for prediction, it draws attention. Scientists begin to ask why that signal matters. What network is producing it? What role does it play in the larger system? In this way, practical success can highlight meaningful structure that theory alone might miss. There is also an ethical dimension to this pragmatism. For someone who cannot speak, the difference between partial restoration and perfect understanding is not academic. It is deeply personal. A decoding system that works imperfectly, that stumbles and improves over time, may still offer a voice where there was silence. This perspective reshapes how we think about progress. Success is not defined by elegance but by usefulness, not by completeness but by impact. Of course, there are limits. Decoding without understanding must be handled carefully. Systems need to be tested rigorously. Their boundaries must be respected. A pattern that predicts speech in one context may fail in another. A stimulation that helps one person may do nothing for someone else. Without theory, there is always a risk of overgeneralization. That is why decoding is often paired with humility. Researchers speak in probabilities, not certainties. They talk about likelihoods, not guarantees. They refine their models constantly, responding to new data rather than clinging to fixed assumptions. This humility is also why decoding does not claim to solve consciousness. Recognizing a pattern associated with attention does not explain what attention feels like. Detecting a shift in mood-related activity does not reveal why sadness carries meaning. These experiences remain, for now, beyond the reach of decoding alone. But perhaps that is not a failure. Perhaps it is a reminder that understanding the brain may require multiple approaches, layered over time. Decoding provides one layer. It maps relationships. It builds bridges between activity and outcome. It creates tools that can listen and respond. Other layers will follow. Theory will grow. Models will deepen. Explanations will become richer. But they will likely do so alongside decoding, not before it. As we move forward, this theme will keep resurfacing in speech, in memory, in attention, and in mood. Decoding has opened doors without fully explaining what lies behind them. It has allowed scientists and clinicians to step into the room to begin helping, even as the larger mystery remains. For now, it is enough to recognize this quiet shift in scientific attitude, from waiting to know everything, to learning enough to act, from demanding perfect clarity, to accepting partial insight paired with careful care. The brain, after all, did not wait to become fully understood before shaping your life. It learned through action, through feedback, through countless small adjustments over time. Decoding mirrors that process. It listens, responds, and improves, one pattern at a time. When we think about speech, we often imagine words forming in the mind and then spilling outward through the mouth. It feels natural to assume that language begins as an idea, which is then translated into sound. But inside the brain, speech does not start as language at all. It starts as movement. Long before a single sound reaches the air, the brain is already busy preparing a sequence of actions. The lips will move. The tongue will shift position, the jaw will open or close, the vocal cords will tighten or relax. Speech is not one motion, but a fast, precise choreography involving dozens of muscles, timed down to tiny fractions of a second. This is where decoding speech finds its footing. Instead of asking the brain what it wants to say, scientists ask a quieter question. What movements is the brain preparing right now? This shift in perspective turns out to be crucial. The brain is very good at planning actions. It does this constantly, whether you are reaching for a cup, tying your shoes, or taking a step forward. These action plans leave reliable traces in neural activity. They are structured, repeatable, and closely linked to physical outcomes. Speech, from the brain's point of view, is just another highly trained action. Researchers studying speech decoding often work with people who, due to injury or disease, can no longer produce spoken sound. Even though their mouths and vocal cords may be unable to move properly, the brain areas responsible for planning speech can remain active. The intention to speak is still there. The plan is still formed. Only the final execution is blocked. By recording activity from regions involved in speech planning, scientists can begin to recognize patterns associated with specific articulatory movements. Not words, but gestures. A rounding of the lips, a lift of the tongue, a tightening in the throat. One of the leaders in this work is Edward Chang, whose research has shown that when people attempt to speak, even silently, the brain produces distinct patterns tied to these planned movements. These patterns are surprisingly consistent. The brain prepares the same kinds of motions again and again, each time you say a familiar sound. This consistency is what makes decoding possible. Imagine watching a skilled dancer rehearse behind a curtain. You cannot see the performance, but you can hear the rhythm of footsteps, the shift of weight, the subtle sounds of motion. Over time, you might begin to recognize when a leap is coming or when the dancer is about to turn. You're not reading the choreography from a page, you're learning its patterns through repetition. Speech decoding works in much the same way. The brain does not plan entire sentences all at once. It plans small units of movement that can be combined in flexible ways. These units are reused constantly. The same tongue motion might appear in many different words. The same lip movement might serve multiple sounds. Language gains its richness not from unique motions, but from recombining a limited set of gestures at remarkable speed. This is why decoding focuses on these building blocks rather than on meaning itself. Meaning is slippery. It depends on context, emotion, memory, and expectation. Movement, by contrast, is grounded. A muscle either prepares to move, or it does not. That preparation leaves a trace that can be detected. When decoding systems are trained, they are shown many examples. The person attempts to speak. The brain activity is recorded. The system learns which patterns tend to appear when certain movements are planned. Over time, it becomes better at predicting which motion is coming next. It is important to note that this prediction is never perfect. The brain is not a rigid machine. Its signals vary slightly from moment to moment. Fatigue, emotion, and attention all influence how strongly patterns appear. Decoding systems must learn to tolerate this variability, focusing on what is consistent rather than what is exact. This variability also reveals something important about how the brain works. Speech planning is not a fixed script. It is a dynamic process, constantly adjusting based on feedback from the body and the environment. Even as you speak, the brain monitors the sound of your own voice, making tiny corrections on the fly. Speech is not delivered, it is steered. By listening to speech planning signals, decoding research highlights this action-based nature of language. Words are not stored as static objects, they are enacted. Each time you speak, you recreate them through movement. This perspective also explains why imagined speech is so much harder to decode. When you only imagine speaking, the brain often prepares the movement less fully. The plan is weaker, more diffuse. Some parts of the choreography are sketched rather than rehearsed. The signals become fainter, harder to distinguish from background activity. Trying to decode imagined speech is like trying to predict a dance when the dancer is only thinking about moving, not actually preparing to step onto the floor. The intention is there, but the structure is incomplete. Still, even these faint signals carry information. They hint at the deep connection between thought and action. Even when no sound is produced, the brain leans toward movement as its primary language. As we drift further into this story, it becomes clear that speech decoding is not about translating thoughts into text. It is about reconnecting intention with action, about finding ways for planned movements, trapped inside the brain, to reach the world again. And perhaps there is something quietly reassuring in that. Language, often treated as an abstract system of symbols, turns out to be deeply physical at its core. It lives in muscles, timing, and motion. It is shaped by breath and bone as much as by ideas. In learning to decode speech, scientists are not pulling words out of the mind. They are listening to the brain as it prepares to move, patiently following the rhythms of action that have always been there, waiting to be heard. If speech was stored in the brain as complete sentences, decoding it would be nearly impossible. Every sentence you have ever spoken would need its own unique neural signature. Every variation in tone, speed, or emotion would multiply the complexity. The brain would quickly drown in its own vocabulary, but that is not how speech works. Instead, the brain relies on something much simpler and much more elegant. It builds language from a small set of reusable sound components. These components are often called phonemes, though it is helpful to think of them less as linguistic symbols and more as physical sound gestures. Each one corresponds to a particular configuration of the mouth, tongue, lips, and voice. In English, there are only a few dozen of these basic sound units. Depending on how you count, the number is somewhere around 40. That means every word you have ever spoken, from your first childhood utterances to your most complicated explanations, is assembled from the same modest collection of pieces. This is a remarkable strategy. Rather than memorizing every possible word, the brain memorizes how to produce a limited set of sounds and how to combine them. It is like building an entire language from a box of small, familiar blocks. The creativity does not come from inventing new blocks, but from arranging the same ones in endlessly flexible ways. For decoding, this changes everything. Instead of trying to recognize complete words or sentences in neural activity, scientists can focus on detecting which sound units are being prepared. These units are far more stable. The brain produces them in similar ways each time, because the physical movements required to generate them are similar each time. A B sound, for example, always involves closing the lips and then releasing them. A T sound involves a precise tap of the tongue. These actions are deeply ingrained through years of practice. The neural patterns that prepare them are among the most well-trained signals the brain produces. This consistency is what allows decoding systems to learn. When researchers record brain activity during speech attempts, they do not see unique signatures for entire words. Instead, they see repeating patterns that align with these smaller sound units. Over time, a system can learn to recognize which unit is likely being prepared next, and then string those predictions together into longer sequences. This process is often described as building a phoneme dictionary, but it is important not to imagine a literal book inside the brain. There is no list of sounds neatly filed away. What exists instead is a network of well-practiced action plans, each one capable of being activated on demand and combined with others in rapid succession. Decoding then becomes an exercise in sequence prediction. Not what word is the person thinking, but which sound unit is likely to come next. This framing also explains why decoded speech often sounds imperfect or mechanical at first. Small errors in predicting individual units can ripple forward, distorting the final output. A missed sound here, an extra one there, and the word changes shape. Human listeners are remarkably good at filling in gaps, but machines are less forgiving. Still, even imperfect reconstruction can be meaningful. For someone who has lost the ability to speak, hearing a rough approximation of their intended words can feel like a bridge back to the world. The goal is not literary perfection, it is connection. There is another important consequence of this building block approach. Because phonemes are physical actions, they are shared across many words. This means that decoding systems trained on a limited vocabulary can sometimes generalize to new words. If the system has learned how the brain prepares each sound unit, it can often assemble unfamiliar combinations without needing to see them in advance. This is a quiet strength of action-based decoding. It does not require exhaustive memorization. It relies on the brain's own compositional strategy. But this strength also highlights a limitation. Phonemes carry sound, not meaning. Two words built from similar sound units can mean very different things. Decoding can reconstruct the shape of speech without knowing its intention. It can tell you what was likely said, but not why it was said, or how it felt to say it. This is why decoding speech is not the same as decoding thought. Thought involves memory, emotion, context, and expectation, all woven together in ways that extend far beyond sound production. Speech is one expression of thought, but it is not thought itself. Decoding captures the outward-facing mechanics, not the inward experience. There is also the question of timing. Speech unfolds rapidly. Sound units blend into one another. The brain often begins preparing the next unit before the current one is fully produced. Decoding systems must track this flow, predicting sequences in real time rather than treating each unit as an isolated event. This makes speech decoding feel less like translation and more like improvisation. The system listens, predicts, adjusts, and listens again, staying in step with a moving target. It is a dance rather than a lookup table. As this work continues, researchers are learning that the brain's preference for reusable pieces is not limited to speech. Similar strategies appear in movement, music, and even thought itself. The brain seems to favour small, flexible units that can be recombined as needed, rather than storing rigid wholes. This insight ties decoding back to a larger theme. The brain is not a warehouse of finished products. It is a workshop. It keeps tools, not outcomes. It remembers how to do things, not just what those things are. In the quiet rhythm of phonemes and gestures, we catch a glimpse of that philosophy at work. Language, one of our most abstract abilities, turns out to be grounded in the same principles that guide walking, reaching, and breathing. It is built from action, shaped by repetition, and refined through use. As we let this idea settle, it prepares us for what comes next. If speech can be reconstructed from its smallest moving parts, then perhaps other mental abilities can be approached the same way. Memory, attention, even mood. Each may be composed not of stored meanings, but of dynamic patterns that can be recognized, nudged, and sometimes restored, one small piece at a time. Up to this point, decoding speech has sounded almost abstract. Patterns, gestures, building blocks. But there is a moment when all of this quiet listening meets something unmistakably human. A moment when intention, trapped inside the brain, becomes audible again. That moment is not dramatic in the way movies imagine. There is no sudden flood of fluent sentences, no instant return to a familiar voice. Instead, there is often a pause, a brief delay, and then a sound that is rough, synthetic, slightly uneven. A voice that does not quite sound like the one the person remembers. And yet, for many people, it is enough to bring tears. To understand why, it helps to think carefully about what is being restored. Decoding does not recover a voice in the emotional sense. It does not recreate tone, personality, or the subtle musicality that makes a voice feel uniquely yours. What it restores first is something more basic and more essential. The ability to act. When a person loses the ability to speak due to paralysis or neurological damage, the loss is not only about sound, it is about agency, the ability to initiate an action and have it reach the world. The brain may still form the plan to speak, still prepare the movements, still intend the outcome, but the chain is broken before execution. Decoding attempts to reconnect that chain. In practical terms, this means taking the predicted sound units, the phonemes the brain appears to be preparing, and feeding them into a speech synthesizer. The synthesizer then produces sound, assembling these units into audible speech. The process is not instantaneous. There's often a short delay as the system listens, predicts, and constructs output. But with practice, this delay can shrink to something that feels conversational. The resulting voice is not the person's original voice. It is closer to a musical instrument being played by intention. The brain provides the score, the machine provides the sound. This difference can be emotionally complex. Some people describe the experience as strange at first, like hearing themselves through someone else's voice. Others describe relief, even joy, at being able to communicate at all. Over time, many adapt, learning how to shape their intentions to work smoothly with the system, just as we all learn to shape our speech to be understood by others. This adaptation reveals something important. Decoding is not a one-way translation. It is a partnership. The brain learns the system just as the system learns the brain. When the output is unclear, the person adjusts. When the system mispredicts, it is retrained. Communication emerges from this mutual calibration, not from perfect decoding alone. There is also a profound difference between decoding spoken speech and decoding imagined speech, and this difference becomes especially visible in these restoration efforts. When a person attempts to speak out loud, the brain prepares a full action plan. Muscles are recruited, timing is precise, feedback loops are engaged. Even if the body cannot execute the plan itself is robust. The neural signals are strong, structured, and easier to detect. Imagined speech is different. When you imagine speaking, you rarely prepare the full set of movements. The intention is lighter, more symbolic. Some parts of the plan are sketched rather than detailed. The brain does not commit fully to action. As a result, the neural signals are weaker, more variable, and harder to decode reliably. This is why decoding imagined speech remains one of the greatest challenges in the field. It is not that the thoughts are hidden deeper. It is that the action plan itself is incomplete. This distinction reinforces a theme that has been quietly building. The brain speaks most clearly when it is preparing to act. When intention is coupled to movement, even imagined movement, the signals become more structured. When intention floats free of action, the structure dissolves. Restoring speech through decoding, then, is not about extracting thoughts from the mind. It is about amplifying intention by giving it a path to completion. There are limits to this approach, and they matter. Decoded speech systems can struggle with speed, nuance, and flexibility. Emotional tone is difficult to capture. Sarcasm, humour, and subtle emphasis often fall away. The voice may sound flat, the rhythm unnatural, but even within these limits, something remarkable happens. People regain the ability to participate, to answer questions, to express needs, to say yes or no, or I am here. In the quiet context of a hospital room or a research lab, this can feel like a small miracle. Not because the technology is perfect, but because it restores a basic human loop. Intention leads to action. Action leads to response. Response leads to meaning. This loop is fragile, and when it breaks, isolation grows quickly. Decoding offers a way to repair it, even imperfectly. There is also a lesson here for how we think about progress. The success of speech restoration does not depend on solving language. It depends on respecting the brain's own strategies. By focusing on action plans rather than abstract meaning, decoding aligns itself with the way the brain naturally operates. The synthetic voice is not the end of the story. It is a beginning, a first bridge built from patterns and probabilities, carrying intention back into the world. As you rest with this idea, it may help to remember how much of communication happens beyond words. A nod, a gesture, a shared rhythm of turn-taking. Speech restoration does not need to be perfect to be powerful. It only needs to be enough. In the soft hum of a synthetic voice, guided by a living brain, we see decoding at its most humane, not as a triumph of technology, but as an act of listening, of noticing when the brain reaches outward and offering it a way to be heard again. And as we drift onward, this same philosophy will reappear in unexpected places, in memory, where retrieval can be helped without knowing why it fails, in attention, where filtering can be tuned without fully understanding consciousness. Again and again, decoding will show us that restoring action can matter deeply, even when explanation lags behind. For now, it is enough to sit with the image of intention finding its voice, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but gently, patiently, one sound at a time. When we talk about memory in everyday life, we almost always use the language of storage. We say that memories are kept, saved, stored away, or lost. We imagine the brain as a kind of archive, filled with folders and shelves, each one holding a record of the past. When we forget something important, it feels as though a file has vanished. But this picture, comforting as it may be, quietly misleads us. Inside the brain, memory does not behave like a library with neatly labelled sections. It behaves much more like a search engine operating without a clear index. Information is not placed in a single location and retrieved later in the same form. Instead, memories are scattered across networks, woven into patterns of activity that overlap, interfere, and sometimes hide from view. This is why forgetting often feels so strange. A name is on the tip of your tongue. A moment feels familiar, but refuses to come into focus. Later, perhaps hours or days afterward, the missing memory suddenly returns, triggered by a smell, a sound, or an unexpected reminder. If the memory had been erased, this would not happen. Something must have remained. From the brain's perspective, memory is not about possession. It is about access. Each act of remembering is an active process. The brain must recreate a pattern that once existed, using cues from the present moment to guide its search. The success of that search depends not only on what was learned in the past, but on the state of the brain right now. Attention, fatigue, emotion, and context all shape whether the correct pathway is found. This way of thinking marks a profound shift. Memory is no longer a static object you either have or do not have. It becomes a dynamic interaction between past experience and present conditions. Researchers who study memory have increasingly embraced this view, including those working in the tradition led by Michael Kahana, whose work emphasizes retrieval as the central challenge of remembering. In this framework, forgetting is not a failure of storage, but a failure of navigation. The information is still there, but the brain cannot reach it efficiently. To understand why, it helps to imagine a vast landscape rather than a filing cabinet. Each experience you have leaves a trace somewhere in this landscape, subtly reshaping its contours. Over time, similar experiences overlap, paths intersect, valleys deepen where memories are frequently revisited. Other areas become harder to reach as the terrain changes. When you try to remember something, your brain sets out across this landscape guided by cues. Sometimes the cues are strong and clear, other times they are vague or misleading. A small change in context can send the search down a different path entirely. This explains why memory is so sensitive to situation. You may remember something easily in one place but struggle to recall it in another. You may forget a fact during an exam, only to remember it effortlessly later while walking home. The memory did not change, the search conditions did. Seen this way, forgetting becomes less like loss and more like temporary disconnection. This perspective also sheds light on why practice and repetition help memory. Each time you successfully retrieve a memory, you strengthen the pathways that lead to it. The landscape becomes easier to navigate. Valleys deepen. Routes become more reliable. Learning, then, is not just about putting information in. It is about practicing how to find it again. Decoding research fits naturally into this picture. When scientists record brain activity during memory tasks, they do not see isolated memory files being opened. They see patterns that suggest a search is underway. Certain rhythms and signals appear when retrieval is likely to succeed. Different patterns emerge when the search falters. These signals do not tell us what the memory contains. They tell us whether the brain is in a state that supports effective searching. This distinction is subtle, but important. Decoding memory is not about reading the content of your past. It is about recognizing the conditions under which access becomes easier or harder. Think of it like trying to find a book in a dark room. The book has not moved. But if the lights are dim, the search is slow and frustrating. turn on a lamp, and suddenly the same room feels navigable. The difference lies not in the book, but in the environment. In the brain, that environment is defined by ongoing activity. Some patterns create clarity, others introduce noise. Memory success depends on whether the internal lighting is right. This way of thinking also softens the emotional weight of forgetting. If memory were a fragile container, every lapse would feel like damage. But if memory is a search, then difficulty does not imply loss. It implies that the system is momentarily out of tune. There is something gently hopeful in that idea. It suggests that memory can be supported not by forcing information in, but by improving the conditions under which retrieval happens. Rest, attention, context, and even subtle shifts in brain state can make a difference. As we move forward, this search-based view will open the door to new possibilities. If certain brain states are more favourable for memory than others, then perhaps those states can be recognised in advance. Perhaps they can even be nudged gently and respectfully toward better alignment. But for now, it is enough to sit with this reimagining. Memory is not a warehouse of facts. It is a living process, unfolding anew each time you remember. It depends on where you are, how you feel, and how your brain is currently organised. In the quiet work of decoding, scientists are beginning to listen not for memories themselves, but for the signs of a search well underway. And in doing so, they're revealing a picture of memory that is less rigid, less brittle, and far more alive than the one we often carry. If memory is a search, then it makes sense that some days feel easier than others. You may wake up clear-headed, words arriving on time, names coming back without effort. On other days, everything feels just out of reach. Facts slip away, familiar details blur. The difference is not effort, it is state. The brain does not operate at a constant setting. Its activity ebbs and flows, influenced by sleep, stress, attention, emotion, and countless subtle factors. These fluctuations create moments when the internal landscape is friendly to searching, and moments when it is not. From the inside, this can feel frustrating, or even personal. From the outside, it can look surprisingly regular. Over the past several years, researchers studying memory have begun to notice something quietly important. Before a memory failure happens, the brain often gives advance notice. Not in words, of course, but in patterns. When people perform memory tasks while their brain activity is recorded, certain signals tend to appear when remembering is likely to succeed. Other signals tend to appear when it is likely to fail. These differences can show up seconds before a person even tries to retrieve a memory. The brain, it seems, knows when it is not ready. This idea challenges a common assumption. We often think that memory failures are caused by the difficulty of the material. The name was hard, the list was long, the information was poorly learned. Sometimes that is true, but often the problem lies elsewhere. The brain simply enters a state where searching is inefficient. Think of it like opening a web browser during a slow internet connection. The website has not disappeared, your computer has not forgotten how to load it, but the conditions are wrong. Pages stall, requests timeout. The same query that works instantly later feels impossible now. In the brain, these conditions are reflected in ongoing electrical rhythms. Some rhythms support coordination across networks, others introduce noise or fragmentation. When coordination drops, the search process becomes unreliable. The brain wanders, loops, or gives up too early. Decoding research has shown that these states can sometimes be recognized in real time. By analyzing patterns of activity just before a memory attempt, models can estimate whether the upcoming retrieval is likely to succeed. This is not a judgment about the person. It is a readout of readiness. The language used here matters. Researchers talk about forecasting rather than diagnosing, predicting rather than labeling. The goal is not to say something is wrong with the brain. The goal is to notice when the conditions are unfavourable. This shift has practical consequences. If a bad memory state can be predicted before an attempt, then the system has a choice. It can proceed anyway, likely producing frustration and failure. Or it can pause, adjust, or intervene gently. Even small changes in timing or state can make a measurable difference. One of the most interesting aspects of this work is its humility. The models do not claim certainty. They operate in probabilities. A given pattern increases the likelihood of failure. Another pattern increases the likelihood of success. The brain is not deterministic in the way a machine is. It is responsive, adaptive, and influenced by noise. And yet within that variability, patterns persist. This persistence suggests that memory success is not solely a matter of willpower. You cannot force the brain into a good state by trying harder. Effort helps only when the system is receptive. When it is not, pushing can even make things worse, increasing stress and further degrading performance. There is something quietly compassionate in this realization. Many people blame themselves for forgetting. They interpret lapses as signs of decline, inattention, or lack of intelligence. A state-based view reframes these experiences. Forgetting becomes less of a personal failure and more of a momentary mismatch between task and condition. Decoding makes this reframing visible. By separating content from state, researchers can show that the same person with the same knowledge can perform very differently depending on subtle internal factors. The memory has not changed. The brain's readiness has. This insight also helps explain why memory training often produces mixed results. Teaching strategies for encoding information can help, but only up to a point. If retrieval depends strongly on state, then training that ignores state will hit a ceiling. You can know how to search, but still struggle if the internal environment is unfavourable. The predictive approach opens another possibility. Instead of judging performance after the fact, systems can support memory proactively. They can learn when to wait, when to cue, when to suggest a break, when to shift attention. It is worth emphasizing what this approach does not do. It does not read memories. It does not identify what you're trying to remember. It does not inspect the content of your mind. It listens only to general signals of coordination and readiness. It cares about the weather, not the destination. This distinction is crucial for both ethics and understanding. Decoding memory states respects the privacy of experience. It does not pry into personal content. It observes only the conditions under which remembering is more or less likely to succeed. There is also an important emotional dimension. When a system predicts a bad memory state, it does not assign blame. It does not say you are wrong to try. It simply recognizes that this moment may not be ideal. Imagine a teacher who knows that a student is exhausted, not unprepared, or a coach who recognizes that an athlete needs rest rather than more drills. Prediction becomes a form of care. As we continue, this predictive framework will become even more concrete. If bad states can be identified, the next question is whether they can be shifted, not overwritten, not forced, but gently nudged in small ways toward better alignment. For now, it is enough to let this idea settle. Memory failure often begins before the attempt itself. The brain signals its readiness quietly, long before frustration appears. Decoding allows us to hear those signals, not to judge them, but to respond with patience. In a world that often demands constant performance, there is something deeply humane about learning when not to push, about recognizing that timing matters, that the brain, like the rest of life, has rhythms, and that sometimes the most effective action is simply to wait for the right moment to search. If memory depends so strongly on state, then an obvious question follows. If the brain is drifting into a poor state for remembering, can it be guided back, quietly, respectfully, toward a better one? The answer emerging from decoding research is careful and modest. Sometimes, yes. But only if the approach is gentle, precisely timed, and willing to work with the brain rather than against it. The idea is not to force memory to improve. It is not to implant new information or overwrite existing experiences. Instead, it is to help the brain return to a state it already knows how to occupy. A state where searching is easier, coordination is higher, and access routes are more open. To understand this, it helps to picture memory states not as switches, but as regions in a landscape. The brain moves through this landscape continuously, guided by sleep, stress, emotion, and ongoing activity. Some regions support memory well, others make it stumble. When decoding systems predict that the brain is drifting into a less favourable region, researchers have explored whether a small nudge, applied at the right moment, can shift its trajectory. Not a shove, not a command, just a subtle adjustment, like tapping the steering wheel to stay in lane. These nudges often take the form of very mild electrical stimulation delivered to specific brain areas involved in memory coordination. The stimulation is not strong enough to trigger activity on its own. Instead, it slightly biases the system, making certain patterns more likely to emerge. Timing is everything. If stimulation is applied randomly, or at the wrong moment, it can have no effect or even make things worse. The brain may resist, or the added input may simply blend into noise. But when stimulation is delivered precisely during a predicted low-performance state, the results can be surprisingly consistent. On average, studies report modest improvements in memory performance, often in the range of 15 to 20%. These numbers are not dramatic. They do not turn struggling memory into perfect recall. And importantly, they vary widely from person to person. This variability matters. Some people benefit more than others. Some show little change. A few may even respond negatively if the timing or placement is off. This reinforces a central lesson of decoding. The brain is not a uniform machine. Interventions must be personalized, adaptive, and reversible. What is perhaps most striking is what these nudges do not do. They do not create new memories. They do not strengthen specific facts. They do not alter the content of experience. Instead, they appear to help the brain re-enter a familiar mode of operation, a way of organizing activity that it has used successfully before. You might think of it like returning to a well-lit room. The furniture has not changed, the objects are in the same places, but once the lights are adjusted, navigating becomes easier. You stop bumping into things. Paths that were always there become visible again. This analogy captures something essential. Memory support is not about adding information. It is about improving access. From a decoding perspective, this makes sense. The system does not know what you are trying to remember. It does not inspect content. It only monitors general signals of readiness and coordination. When those signals dip, it responds with a small adjustment designed to restore balance. There is a subtle philosophical implication here. Memory, in this view, is not a fragile storehouse that needs constant reinforcement. It is a robust process that sometimes loses its footing. Helping it recover does not require rebuilding the structure. It requires helping the system find its stance again. This approach also highlights the importance of respect. Because stimulation does not target specific memories, it avoids many ethical concerns associated with more invasive ideas. It does not manipulate personal content. It does not insert or erase experiences. it simply supports the brain's own dynamics. Still, caution is essential. Even gentle nudges can have unintended effects if applied without care. The brain is deeply interconnected. A change in one area can ripple outward in unexpected ways. This is why researchers emphasize reversibility and monitoring. If a nudge does not help, it can be withdrawn. The system can learn from the outcome. Another important aspect of this work is that improvement often unfolds over time. The immediate effect of stimulation may be subtle, but by repeatedly supporting favorable states, the brain may relearn how to enter them more easily on its own. In this sense, stimulation becomes less like a crutch and more like a guide. This mirrors how learning often works in everyday life. A reminder, given at the right moment, can help you remember something later without the reminder. A small cue can retrain attention. Over time, the system internalizes the support. It is also worth noting that these interventions work best when paired with natural processes. Adequate sleep, focused attention, and meaningful engagement all enhance their effectiveness. Decoding does not replace these fundamentals, it complements them. The broader lesson is one of humility. Even with sophisticated tools, the brain resists heavy-handed control. It responds best to cooperation. Decoding allows scientists to listen first, understand when the system is struggling, and intervene only as much as needed. For someone experiencing memory difficulties, this approach can feel reassuring. It does not frame the problem as damage or decline, it frames it as misalignment, a system that sometimes needs help finding its rhythm. As we prepare to move onward, it is helpful to hold on to this image. The brain as a dynamic process, drifting through states, sometimes losing balance, sometimes regaining it with a gentle touch. Decoding does not command this process, it accompanies it. In the soft space between prediction and action, between noticing and nudging, memory support becomes something quiet and humane. Not a dramatic cure, but a careful collaboration with a system that has been learning all its life. And as we turn toward attention next, we will see that this same principle applies beyond memory. Whether selecting what to focus on, filtering noise, or guiding action, the brain depends on subtle balances. Decoding helps us see when those balances tip, and how sometimes they can be restored. It is tempting to think of attention as a beam of light, something you point toward an object, illuminating it while the rest of the world fades into darkness. This image is simple, intuitive, and deeply embedded in how we talk about focus. We say we pay attention to something, as if attention were a resource we hand over, but inside the brain, attention works very differently. The world does not arrive in neat pieces, waiting politely to be noticed. It arrives all at once. Sounds overlap, sights compete, sensations collide. If the brain attempted to process everything with equal priority, it would be overwhelmed almost instantly. Attention exists not to highlight reality, but to protect the brain from it. From this perspective, attention is not about seeing more, it is about doing less. The brain's most urgent task is not perception, it is action. Every moment the brain must decide what to do next, where to move, what to say, whether to respond or remain still. Attention serves this process by filtering the flood of incoming information, allowing only what matters for action to pass through. In other words, attention is a gatekeeper. Rather than shining outward, it stands at the entrance, deciding which signals are worth considering and which can be safely ignored. This decision is rarely conscious. It happens automatically, shaped by goals, habits, and expectations. You do not choose to ignore the hum of a refrigerator. Your brain filters it out because it has learned that it rarely demands action. This filtering becomes obvious when something breaks the pattern. A sudden bang, the sound of your name spoken in a crowd, a change that signals potential importance. Attention snaps into place, not because the sound is louder, but because it carries meaning for action. Decoding research has embraced this action-centered view of attention. When scientists record brain activity during attention tasks, they do not see a single region lighting up like a spotlight. They see coordination, signals flowing from areas involved in planning and decision-making toward areas that process sensory input. The brain prepares itself to act, and attention follows. This top-down influence is crucial. It means that attention is not driven solely by the world. It is guided by internal goals. What you expect to matter shapes what you notice. The brain does not passively receive reality. It actively selects from it. This selection process can be observed in both humans and animals. In laboratory studies, animals trained to respond to specific cues show changes in neural activity even before the cue appears. The brain prepares the gate in advance, tuning itself to what is likely to be relevant. When the expected signal arrives, it passes through easily. When it does not, it is filtered out. Researchers studying these mechanisms, including those working in the line of inquiry associated with Michael Halassa, have shown that attention relies on networks that connect decision-making regions with sensory areas. These networks do not enhance all input. They suppress most of it. What remains feels clear, not because it is stronger, but because everything else has been quieted. This reframing helps explain why attention feels effortful. Maintaining a gate requires energy. It requires the brain to actively hold a goal in mind and continuously compare incoming information against it. When you're tired or stressed, this process weakens. The gate slips. Irrelevant signals leak through. Distraction increases. Importantly, this leakage is not a failure of will. It is a shift in state. Just as with memory, attention depends on the brain's overall condition. Fatigue, emotional load, and competing demands all influence how well the gate can be maintained. Decoding studies reveal that lapses of attention are often preceded by measurable changes in brain activity. The system begins to lose coordination before distraction becomes noticeable. This insight softens how we interpret inattention. Rather than blaming a lack of discipline, we can recognize a system under strain. Attention is not a muscle that simply needs more effort. It is a dynamic process that requires support. The action-based view of attention also clarifies why multitasking is so costly. Each task demands its own gate configuration. Switching tasks means reconfiguring the filter, redirecting priorities, and recalibrating action plans. The brain can do this, but not instantly, and not without cost. What feels like juggling is often rapid dropping and picking up. Decoding attention does not involve reading thoughts. It involves detecting when the gate is open, closed, or unstable. By listening to patterns of coordination, researchers can estimate whether the brain is currently aligned with a task or drifting away from it. This does not tell us what someone is thinking. It tells us whether the system is ready to act in a focused way. There is also a deeper implication here. If attention serves action, then perception itself is shaped by what the brain believes it might need to do. You do not see the world as it is. You see the world as it relates to possible actions. Objects become tools, obstacles, or opportunities, depending on context. This is why attention can feel so personal. Two people in the same room can notice entirely different things, not because their eyes differ, but because their goals do. Each brain tunes its gate according to its own priorities. As we let this idea settle, it prepares us for a subtle shift. Attention is not simply about clarity. It is about commitment. To attend to something is to prepare to act upon it. To ignore something is to decide, often unconsciously, that it does not matter right now. Decoding research makes this process visible without reducing it to a simple switch. It shows us a system constantly balancing openness and protection, responsiveness and restraint. A gate that must remain flexible to survive in a noisy world. In the quiet space before sleep, this understanding can be strangely comforting. You do not need to attend to everything. Your brain is built to choose, and when it feels scattered, it may not be because you are failing, but because the gate is tired. As we continue, we will see how this gatekeeping role of attention becomes even more complex. Not only does the brain decide what to let in, it also decides how much weight to give it. And when that weighting goes wrong, the world itself can begin to feel distorted. But for now, it is enough to rest with this gentle truth. Attention is not a spotlight demanding constant effort. It is a guardian, quietly working to ensure that action remains possible in a world that never stops arriving. If attention were only a gate that opens and closes, the brain's job would still be difficult but manageable. Let this signal in, keep that one out. But the world is rarely that simple. Signals are rarely all or nothing. They arrive with ambiguity, overlap, and noise. The brain must decide not only what to attend to, but how much to trust what it receives. This is where a deeper view of attention begins to emerge. Inside the brain, attention behaves less like a switch and more like a system of weighting. Incoming information is not simply accepted or rejected, it is assigned importance. Some signals are amplified, others are dampened. Most are allowed through only faintly, acknowledged, but not prioritized. In this sense, attention operates as a form of inference. The brain is constantly making educated guesses about what matters right now. These guesses are based on past experience, current goals, and expectations about what is likely to happen next. Attention reflects these expectations. It highlights what the brain believes will be useful for guiding action. This process is not conscious. You do not sit and calculate probabilities. The brain does it automatically, continuously, adjusting its internal weights as conditions change. Imagine walking through a forest path. Most of the time, your brain assigns low importance to rustling leaves or shifting shadows. They're common, usually harmless, but if you know that falling branches are possible after a storm, your brain may raise the weight on those sounds. The same sensory input now carries more significance. Attention sharpens, not because the sound changed, but because your expectation did. Decoding research has shown that this weighting process can be observed in neural activity. Rather than a single burst of focus, scientists see graded changes. Signals associated with relevant information grow stronger. Signals associated with irrelevant information grow weaker. The balance shifts moment by moment. This is why attention feels flexible. It is not locked onto one thing. It continuously recalibrates. Researchers studying attention circuits, including those building on the work associated with Michael Alassa, have demonstrated that these weightings depend on communication between brain regions involved in planning and those involved in sensing. The brain's expectations shape how incoming information is treated before it ever reaches awareness. This framework helps explain why attention can sometimes mislead us. If the brain assigns too much weight to a signal that turns out to be unimportant, the world can feel overly intense. Ordinary details stand out. Coincidences feel meaningful. Patterns appear where none exist. The gate is open, but the weighting is off. Conversely, if the brain assigns too little weight to relevant signals, important information slips by unnoticed. You miss a cue, forget a detail, fail to respond in time. The gate is present, but it is tuned too low. These errors are not moral failures, they are inference errors. The brain operates under uncertainty. It must act without complete information. Attention reflects the best guess available at the time. Most of the time, these guesses are good enough. But under stress, fatigue, or altered brain states, the weighting system can drift. Decoding attention, then, is not about identifying a single focus point. It is about tracking how importance is distributed across possibilities. By listening to patterns of coordination, researchers can infer whether the brain is weighting signals appropriately or drifting toward extremes. This perspective also explains why attention training is so difficult. You cannot simply command the brain to care less or more. Weighting emerges from experience and expectation. Changing it requires altering the brain's beliefs about what matters, not just forcing concentration. It also explains why attention and emotion are so tightly linked. Emotions act as powerful signals of importance. Fear raises weights dramatically. Curiosity does the same, though more gently. Depression, anxiety, and other mood states can bias the weighting system, causing certain kinds of information to dominate awareness. When decoding research intersects with clinical work, this connection becomes especially relevant. In some conditions, attention weighting becomes rigid. The brain assigns high importance to negative or irrelevant signals and struggles to adjust. The world feels overwhelming or threatening, even when it is not. This does not mean the brain is broken. It means its inference system is stuck in an unhelpful configuration. Understanding attention as probabilistic inference helps bridge what might otherwise feel like separate domains. Memory, attention, and mood begin to look like variations on a common theme. Each involves assigning weight to possibilities. Each depends on state. Each can drift, and sometimes be guided back. There is something quietly unifying about this view. It suggests that the brain is not failing when attention wavers or misfires. It is doing what it has always done, making the best guess it can with limited information. Decoding does not judge these guesses, it observes them. By recognizing when the weighting system is skewed, decoding opens the door to gentle correction, not by dictating what the brain should attend to, but by helping it regain flexibility, by supporting the conditions under which weighting can adjust naturally. As you rest with this idea, it may feel surprisingly relevant to everyday life. Moments when the mind fixates, moments when everything feels urgent, moments when nothing seems to matter. These experiences are not random. They reflect how importance is being assigned behind the scenes. Attention, seen this way, is not a moral achievement. It is a moving balance, and like all balances, it can tip. The goal is not to hold it perfectly still, but to allow it to sway without falling. Decoding helps us see when the sway becomes a stumble, and how small shifts can restore equilibrium. In the quiet space before sleep, this understanding can be soothing. You do not need to control attention completely. You only need to allow it to settle. The brain knows how to recalibrate when given the chance. As we move forward, this idea of weighting will take on even greater importance. When weighting becomes locked into a single pattern, mood can become trapped. When flexibility returns, learning resumes. For now, it is enough to recognize attention for what it is. Not a spotlight demanding constant effort, but a living inference system, quietly deciding what matters most in an uncertain world. For a long time, depression has been described in simple terms: a lack of chemicals, an imbalance to be corrected, a deficit to be filled. These explanations were not wrong so much as incomplete. They offered a handle on something deeply complex, but they also quietly suggested that mood could be fixed by targeting a single cause. Decoding research has gently pushed us away from that idea. When scientists listen to the depressed brain, They do not hear silence, they hear activity. In fact, they often hear too much of the same thing. Patterns repeat, networks loop. The brain seems to revisit the same configurations again and again, even when circumstances change. This repetition hints at a different way of understanding depression, not as a missing ingredient, but as a system caught in a rigid state. To see why this matters, it helps to think of the brain as a landscape of possible activity patterns, similar to the memory states we explored earlier. At any given moment, the brain occupies one region of this landscape. From there, it can move smoothly into nearby regions, adapting to new situations, learning from feedback, and updating expectations. In a healthy system, this movement is flexible. The brain can shift from rest to focus, from sadness to relief, from effort to ease. No single pattern dominates for too long. In depression, this flexibility narrows. Certain networks become overly stable. They pull activity back toward familiar configurations, even when those configurations are painful or unhelpful. Negative thoughts recur. Motivation drains away. The future feels closed, not because it truly is, but because the brain struggles to imagine alternative paths. This does not happen because the brain wants to suffer. It happens because stability, even in a bad state, can feel safer than uncertainty. Decoding studies support this view by showing that depressed brains often display reduced variability. Signals become less exploratory. Coordination patterns repeat more rigidly. The system appears to lose its ability to wander freely through its own landscape. This is where the network perspective becomes crucial. Rather than asking which chemical is missing, researchers ask which circuits are over-constraining the system, which loops keep firing, which pathways dominate attention and memory. Depression begins to look less like a broken part and more like a traffic jam. One of the pioneers of this way of thinking is Helen Mayberg, whose work reframed severe depression as a disorder of network dynamics. In her approach, no single region is blamed. Instead, certain hubs are identified as critical junctions where activity patterns converge and become stuck. When these hubs dominate, they can bias the entire system toward negative interpretation. Attention weights skew. Memory retrieval favors loss and failure. Action plans collapse before they begin. The brain's inference machinery, which once helped navigate uncertainty, becomes trapped in a narrow range of expectations. What is striking is how this view aligns with lived experience. People with depression often describe feeling stuck, not just sad, but unable to move emotionally, unable to imagine change, unable to access memories or motivations that once felt natural. These descriptions match what decoding reveals at the neural level, a system with reduced freedom to reconfigure. This framing also explains why depression is so heterogeneous. Two people may share a diagnosis while experiencing very different symptoms. The specific networks involved may differ. The degree of rigidity may vary. The paths into and out of the state may not be the same. Decoding does not erase this individuality. It highlights it. By listening to network activity rather than hunting for a universal defect, researchers can begin to see depression as a family of patterns rather than a single disease. This opens the door to more personalized approaches, where treatment is guided by how a particular brain is organized, not just by symptom lists. It also reframes recovery. If depression is a rigid state, then recovery is not about installing happiness. It is about restoring movement, about helping the brain regain access to alternative configurations, about reopening pathways that allow learning and adaptation to resume. This idea carries an important ethical implication. It removes blame. Depression is not a failure of character or effort. It is a state the brain enters and struggles to exit. Understanding this can soften self-judgment and encourage patience. Decoding contributes to this compassion by making the invisible visible. It shows that mood is not simply a feeling floating in the mind. It is grounded in activity patterns that can be observed, predicted, and in some cases, gently influenced. At the same time, decoding does not pretend to explain everything. It cannot tell us why one pattern feels heavy while another feels light. It cannot translate neural rigidity directly into subjective suffering. Those experiences remain deeply personal, but what it can do is clarify the structure beneath the experience. It can show that depression is not emptiness, it is presence. Too much of the same thing, held too tightly. As we rest with this idea, it prepares us for the next step. If depression involves networks that are stuck, then the question becomes whether those networks can be nudged out of their ruts, not forced, not erased, but loosened just enough to allow movement again. The answer to that question lies in a form of intervention that has drawn both hope and caution. A technique designed not to fix chemicals but to interrupt patterns, to quiet the noise long enough for the brain to remember how to change. We will turn to that next. For now, it is enough to recognize depression as something the brain does, not something a person is, a state, not an identity, a configuration that, with care and understanding, may yet give way to something more flexible. If depression is a brain caught in a narrow configuration, then helping it change does not necessarily require adding something new. Sometimes it requires removing an obstacle, a kind of internal noise that keeps pulling the system back into the same shape. This is the quiet idea behind deep brain stimulation. Despite its name, deep brain stimulation is not dramatic in practice. It does not flood the brain with electricity. It does not force happiness or implant new feelings. Instead, it applies a carefully controlled, continuous signal to a specific hub within a larger network, one that has been identified as overly influential in maintaining depressive patterns. The goal is not to excite the brain, but to interrupt it. When stimulation is applied to this hub, many patients describe a striking experience. The emotional heaviness does not gradually lift the way it might with medication or therapy. Instead, it seems to switch off, not replaced by joy, not transformed into optimism, but simply absent. As one patient famously put it, the negative feeling turns off. This description is important because it reveals what stimulation is actually doing. Deep brain stimulation does not generate positive emotion. It removes a constraint. It quiets a loop that has been dominating the system, allowing other patterns to re-emerge. The brain does not suddenly become happy. It becomes available. In the absence of the constant negative pull, the brain begins to explore again. Attention can widen. Memory retrieval becomes less biased. Action plans that were previously blocked can form and unfold. Over time, this renewed flexibility allows learning to resume. This is why the effects of stimulation are often described in two phases. The first phase is immediate and noticeable. The oppressive tone recedes, the internal noise fades. Patients may feel lighter, clearer, or simply less burdened. This phase can be dramatic, but it is also incomplete. The second phase unfolds slowly. With the rigid pattern interrupted, the brain must relearn how to move. Old habits of thought and behavior do not vanish overnight. Therapy, social engagement, and everyday experience all play a role in shaping what comes next. Stimulation creates an opening. Life fills it. This distinction matters because it guards against misunderstanding. Deep brain stimulation is not a cure in the sense of replacing depression with happiness. It is a reset of conditions, a chance for the brain to exit a loop and regain access to change. From a decoding perspective, this makes sense. Earlier, we saw that decoding focuses on states rather than content, on patterns rather than meanings. Deep brain stimulation operates at this same level. It does not target thoughts, it targets dynamics. By altering the balance of activity within a network, it changes the state space the brain can occupy. There is also an important lesson here about timing and persistence. The stimulation is continuous, not pulsed in response to momentary signals. This reflects the nature of depression itself. The problem is not a brief lapse, it is a sustained pattern. Interrupting that pattern requires sustained influence, applied gently but consistently. At the same time, the stimulation is adjustable and reversible. Parameters can be tuned, effects can be monitored. If the intervention is not helpful, it can be altered or stopped. This reversibility is central to the ethical framework surrounding its use. It is also worth noting how selective this intervention is. Deep brain stimulation targets a specific hub within a broader network, not the entire brain. This precision reflects years of careful mapping and listening. It is the result of understanding which nodes exert disproportionate influence over the system's dynamics. Even so, the effects can ripple outward. When a dominant loop is quieted, other networks adjust in response. The brain reorganizes itself, often in ways that are unique to each individual. This individuality reinforces the need for careful follow-up and personalization. One of the most striking aspects of deep brain stimulation is how it reframes the experience of agency. Patients often report that, after stimulation, they can choose differently. Not because they are being pushed towards specific actions, but because options that were previously inaccessible have returned. Motivation does not need to be injected, it can arise naturally once the block is removed. This aligns with the broader theme running through decoding. Action matters. The brain learns through doing. When depression blocks action, learning stalls. When action becomes possible again, learning resumes. There is also a quiet humility in how researchers describe these effects. They do not claim to understand why a particular hub holds such power, or why interrupting it has such profound consequences. They observe the pattern, test the intervention, and refine their understanding based on outcomes. This humility is essential because deep brain stimulation is not without risk. It is reserved for severe cases where other treatments have failed. It requires surgery. It demands careful oversight. It is not a solution to be generalized casually. But as a window into how mood is organized, it is invaluable. It shows that suffering can be sustained by dynamics rather than defects, that relief can come from restoring flexibility rather than imposing change, and that learning, once unblocked, can do much of the remaining work. As we let this idea settle, it offers a gentler way of thinking about recovery. Progress does not always mean feeling better right away. Sometimes it means feeling less trapped, less constrained, more open to what comes next. Deep brain stimulation does not promise happiness, it promises possibility. And in the context of a brain that has forgotten how to change, that promise can be profound. As we move forward toward questions of meaning and consciousness, this lesson will remain with us. The brain is not a static object to be fixed, it is a process to be supported. When the noise quiets, even briefly, the system remembers how to learn again. It is easy to imagine that the brain builds meaning by collecting sensations. Light enters the eyes, sound reaches the ears, signals flow inward, and somewhere inside, understanding forms. This picture feels intuitive because experience seems to arrive from the outside. But when neuroscientists look closely, a different story emerges. Neurons never encounter the world itself. They do not see light or hear sound. They receive only signals from other neurons. A neuron's entire universe consists of electrical impulses arriving along its connections. It has no access to objects, colours, or words. It knows only patterns of activity. This raises a quiet but profound question. If neurons never touch the world, how does meaning arise at all? The answer suggested by a growing body of theoretical work is surprisingly simple. Meaning does not come from sensation alone, it comes from action. From this inside-out perspective, the brain does not begin with a picture of the world and then decide how to respond. It begins with the need to act. Movement, exploration, and feedback give sensory signals their significance. The brain learns what signals matter by discovering how its actions change what happens next. Consider a simple example. Imagine holding a stick and dipping it into water. To your eyes, the stick appears bent at the surface. If sensation alone defined meaning, the brain would conclude that the stick is broken. But it does not. You move the stick. You feel resistance. You lift it out of the water and see it straighten again. Through action, the brain learns how to interpret the sensory distortion. The sensation is ambiguous. The action resolves it. This kind of learning happens constantly, often without awareness. Infants reach, grasp, fall, and try again. Each action generates feedback. Over time, the brain builds internal maps that link signals to outcomes. These maps are not pictures of the world. They are expectations about how actions change experience. From this view, perception itself becomes a kind of prediction. The brain anticipates the consequences of action and compares them with what actually occurs. When predictions fail, learning happens. When they succeed, meaning stabilizes. Researchers who emphasize this framework, including theorists such as Urey, argue that understanding emerges from closed loops. Action leads to sensation. Sensation updates expectations. Expectations guide the next action. Meaning lives in this cycle, not in any single signal. This idea helps unify many of the themes we have explored so far. Speech, for example, is not decoded by extracting words from the brain. It is reconstructed by listening to action plans. Memory is not accessed by opening a storage vault. It is retrieved through active search, guided by present conditions. Attention is not a spotlight on reality. It is a system for weighting signals based on their relevance to action. In each case, the brain's primary concern is not representation, but engagement. Decoding fits naturally into this picture. By focusing on patterns associated with action readiness, decoding systems align with how the brain organizes meaning. They do not ask what the world is, they ask what the brain is prepared to do. This also clarifies why purely passive decoding has limits. If meaning is grounded in action, then observing neural activity in isolation will never fully capture experience. A signal divorced from behavior loses its anchor. It becomes a trace without context. This is not a flaw in decoding, it is a boundary. Decoding can reveal how the brain prepares, searches, filters, and reconfigures. It can map the scaffolding that supports experience, but it cannot replace the loop itself. Meaning lives in motion. There is something quietly reassuring about this. It suggests that understanding is not something the brain stores and risks losing. It is something the brain does, again and again, through interaction. Even when sensation is noisy or incomplete, action can restore clarity. This inside-out view also reframes learning. Learning is not about absorbing information. It is about refining expectations through use. A map is not learned by looking at it once. It is learned by navigating, making mistakes, and adjusting. The brain learns the same way. From this angle, consciousness begins to look less like a theatre, where sensations are displayed, and more like a process of coordination. The brain integrates signals in service of action, and awareness arises as part of that integration. Importantly, this does not mean that sensation is unimportant. Sensory signals provide the raw material, but without action they remain ambiguous. It is only when signals are tied to consequences that they acquire stable meaning. As we approach the end of this journey, this idea will become increasingly important. It sets the stage for understanding why decoding can succeed in restoring function without explaining experience, why we can help someone speak or remember without fully capturing what it feels like to speak or remember. Meaning, in this framework, is not hidden inside neurons waiting to be uncovered. It is enacted. It appears when the brain engages the world and adjusts to the results. In the quiet moments before sleep, this perspective can feel grounding. You do not need to hold the world perfectly in your mind. You only need to remain capable of acting within it. Understanding follows from participation. As we continue toward questions of consciousness itself, this inside-out view will help us keep our footing. It reminds us that the brain is not a mirror of reality. It is a partner in an ongoing exchange, and meaning is born, again and again, in the space where intention meets outcome. When people ask whether neuroscience can explain consciousness, they're often asking several different questions at once. Are we awake or asleep, aware or unconscious? And also, what does it feel like to be here at all? These questions sound similar, but inside the brain they point to very different problems. Decoding research has helped make this distinction clearer, not by solving it, but by showing where its limits lie. The first kind of consciousness is practical and clinical. It has to do with whether a person is awake, responsive, and capable of interacting with the world. Doctors assess it every day. Can the patient open their eyes? Follow a command? Track a sound? This form of consciousness depends on the integrity of deep brain systems that regulate arousal, and on large-scale coordination between regions. When these systems are disrupted, consciousness fades, sleep deepens, anesthesia takes hold. In severe cases, awareness may not return at all. Here, decoding has been genuinely useful. By listening to patterns of brain activity, clinicians can often distinguish between different levels of wakefulness. They can sometimes detect covert awareness in patients who appear unresponsive. They can monitor how anesthesia changes global coordination. In this domain, decoding works well because the question is about state. Is the system globally active or not? Are networks communicating or fragmented? These are patterns the brain expresses clearly. But there is a second kind of consciousness that resists this approach. This is the kind that asks what it is like to feel pain, to see red, to remember a childhood room, or to experience a thought as your own. This experiential or phenomenal consciousness is not about whether the system is on. It is about what the system feels like from the inside. Decoding struggles here, and for good reason. Patterns of neural activity can tell us that something is happening. They can sometimes tell us which task is being performed, but they do not tell us how it feels. Two brains may show similar activity while experiencing something very different. The signal does not carry the quality of experience with it. This is not a failure of measurement, it is a limitation of perspective. Neural recordings are always third person. They observe from the outside. Experience is always first person. It is lived, not measured. No matter how detailed a pattern becomes, it remains a pattern seen from afar. This is why decoding has been careful not to overclaim. It does not promise to read subjective experience directly. It does not claim to extract feelings or thoughts in their raw form. Instead, It maps the conditions under which experience is likely to occur. One of the most revealing findings in neuroscience is how much of the brain's work happens without conscious awareness. Most perception, memory retrieval, and decision-making unfolds quietly, beneath the surface. By the time a thought enters awareness, it has already been shaped by countless unconscious processes. Decoding makes this visible. When researchers decode speech, they see planning before awareness. When they decode memory, they see readiness before recall. When they decode attention, they see waiting before focus. Consciousness appears late in the process, as a kind of summary rather than a starting point. This does not make consciousness unimportant. It makes it selective. Awareness seems to arise when information becomes relevant for coordination across systems, when something needs to be integrated, shared, or acted upon in a flexible way. In this sense, consciousness may be less about representing the world and more about aligning action. This idea fits naturally with the action-based framework we explored earlier. Meaning arises through interaction. Consciousness may be one way the brain manages complex interactions that cannot be handled automatically. From this perspective, consciousness is not a constant spotlight shining on everything. It is a workspace that opens when needed. When tasks become routine, awareness fades. When novelty or conflict arises, it returns. Decoding supports this view by showing how rarely consciousness is required for basic function. You can walk, speak familiar phrases, recognize faces, and navigate spaces with little conscious effort. The brain handles these tasks through well-practiced patterns. Awareness steps in when those patterns need adjustment. This also helps explain why decoding can restore function without explaining experience. A person can regain the ability to speak through a decoding system even if the system has no access to what speaking feels like. Action can be restored without capturing phenomenology. Similarly, stimulation can relieve depressive rigidity by altering network dynamics, even though it does not generate happiness directly. The conditions for experience change, and experience follows in its own way. This separation between mechanism and feeling can be unsettling. We often want an explanation that bridges the two. How does activity become experience? Why does this pattern feel like sadness and that one like hope? Neuroscience does not yet have an answer. Some theories suggest that consciousness arises from integrated information. Others emphasize global broadcasting across networks. Still others focus on prediction, embodiment, or self-modeling. Each offers insight, but none has closed the gap. Decoding does not resolve this debate, it sharpens it, by showing how much can be achieved without touching phenomenology. Decoding reveals how deep the mystery remains. It reminds us that understanding the brain's operations is not the same as explaining experience, and yet there is something quietly reassuring in this honesty. It means that the richness of experience is not easily reduced. It resists simple capture. It remains personal, first person, and irreducible in important ways. Decoding can support life, restore action, and reduce suffering without claiming ownership of what it feels like to be you. As we approach the final session, this distinction will guide our conclusion. We have learned to listen to the brain's patterns. We have learned to predict, nudge, and restore certain functions. But we have not explained consciousness itself. Perhaps that is not a failure, but a boundary. In the soft quiet before sleep, it may be enough to know this. You're not fully described by signals. Your experience is not exhausted by patterns. Decoding can help the brain act, but experience remains something you live, not something a machine can read. And in that space between what can be decoded and what can only be felt, the mystery of consciousness continues to breathe. By now, a quiet pattern has emerged. Across speech, memory, attention, and mood, decoding has shown us something remarkably consistent. The brain is not a vault of stored meanings waiting to be unlocked. It is a living system, constantly preparing, searching, filtering, and adjusting. When scientists listen carefully to its activity, they do not hear thoughts, they hear readiness, they hear coordination, they hear states shifting. This alone is a meaningful achievement. Decoding has revealed that many abilities we once thought were lost are still present, simply disconnected from action. A person who cannot speak may still plan speech. A person who struggles to remember may still hold the memory, waiting for the right conditions to retrieve it. A person overwhelmed by depression may still have the capacity to learn and adapt, temporarily trapped in a rigid pattern. In each case, decoding does not restore the content of experience, it restores access. This distinction is subtle, but it runs through everything we have explored. Speech decoding reconnects intention with sound. Memory decoding reconnects stored experience with retrieval. Attention decoding reconnects signals with relevance. Mood-related decoding reconnects the brain with flexibility. These are not trivial reconnections. They can change lives. At the same time, decoding has been honest about its limits. It does not claim to read meaning itself. It does not translate experience into symbols. It does not tell us why a particular memory feels warm, or why sadness carries weight, or why a voice sounds like home. This honesty matters. There is a temptation, whenever technology advances, to believe that the final explanation is just one step away. That if we record more neurons, map more circuits, or build better models, experience itself will eventually reveal its secrets. Decoding invites a gentler conclusion. What if explanation and experience are not the same kind of thing? Throughout this journey, we have seen that decoding works best when it aligns with action, when it listens to how the brain prepares to move, to speak, to search, to choose. Action leaves structure. It leaves patterns that can be recognized and supported. Experience, by contrast, does not leave a clear trace. It is lived, not encoded. This does not mean experience is irrelevant. It means it occupies a different role. Consciousness may not be the source of all brain activity, but it is where meaning is felt. It is where outcomes matter. Decoding can influence the conditions that shape experience without capturing experience itself. It can quiet a rigid loop and allow relief to emerge. It can open a path for speech and allow expression to return. But it cannot substitute for the feeling of speaking or the relief of being understood. In this sense, decoding is like a map. A map can guide you through a city. It can show you where roads connect, where obstacles lie, and where paths are likely to lead. It can even help you avoid getting lost. But the map is not the city. It does not contain the sound of footsteps, the smell of rain, or the feeling of arriving somewhere meaningful. Confusing the two leads to disappointment. Understanding this difference allows decoding to be appreciated for what it truly is. Not an answer to consciousness, but a tool for care. Not a theory of meaning, but a way to support action. Not a replacement for experience, but a bridge back to it. There is also a deeper lesson here about learning. Again and again we have seen that the brain changes through use. It does not wait to be fully understood before adapting. It learns through feedback, through small corrections, through repeated engagement with the world. Decoding mirrors this process. It does not impose a final model. It listens, adjusts, and improves. This symmetry is not accidental. The brain and the tools built to support it are converging on the same principle. Progress comes from interaction, not from complete knowledge. As we step back, it becomes clear that decoding has shifted neuroscience in an important way. It has moved the field from asking only, "What does this region do?" to asking, "What state is the system in right now and how can it change?" This shift prioritizes dynamics over labels, movement over structure. It also reshapes how we think about responsibility and compassion. When forgetting is framed as a state rather than a flaw, blame softens. When inattention is seen as a gate under strain rather than a moral failure, patience grows. When depression is understood as a network caught in a rigid loop rather than a lack of will, space opens for care. Decoding does not solve these problems, but it reframes them, and reframing can be powerful. Still, the mystery remains. Why does a particular pattern of activity feel like sadness rather than fear? Why does awareness accompany some processes and not others? Why does experience arise at all? These questions sit beyond the reach of decoding, at least for now. Perhaps they always will. That possibility need not be discouraging. Some mysteries are not obstacles to be overcome. They are boundaries that give shape to inquiry. They remind us that understanding the brain does not require reducing the person, that supporting function does not require owning experience. In the quiet hours when this kind of knowledge is meant to accompany sleep rather than stimulate debate, there is something comforting in this restraint. The brain is not a puzzle to be solved once and for all. It is a living process, unfolding moment by moment. Decoding has taught us how to listen better, how to recognize patterns that matter, how to intervene with humility. It has shown us that action can be restored without explanation, and that relief can come before understanding. And perhaps that is enough. As this journey comes to a close, you might notice your own attention settling, your thoughts slowing, your body preparing for rest. None of this requires decoding. Your brain knows how to do it. It has learned, over a lifetime, how to transition from effort to ease. In that transition, meaning does not need to be explained. It is simply felt. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you can carry this gentle truth with you. Science can map the brain's movements and support its actions. Experience remains yours alone. And between the two, there is space for curiosity, care, and quiet wonder. Thank you for taking this journey. Wherever you are and whatever state your brain is in right now, may it find its way gently and patiently into rest.